To understand the complete picture of World War II, I want to take you to Europe in the time period before the United States is going to get involved in the war. Right, we're going to get involved when the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. Spoiler alert, I guess that's coming up later. But the war itself is going to start September 1st, 1939, when the Germans invade Poland against the wishes of the British and the French, who will then declare war on the Germans. And so there are a couple of years of warfare that are going to be happening before the United States ever gets involved. So to understand kind of the complete picture, we need to take a look at what's going on in those early years. Like I said, the main conflict is going to start over the country of Poland. Now, we have a map activity that you're going to take a look at, or maybe already have taken a look at, where you're going to see these countries laid out. And the country of Poland is directly in between the Soviet Union on the east side and Germany on the west. Now, if you remember all the way back to that World War I, the first World War I map we did, we know that this territory that was Poland was part of the German Empire. And so Hitler's looking to expand back out. But he's got to be careful, especially in those early days, of looking too aggressive to the Soviets. They didn't like each other, didn't necessarily trust each other. But on August 23rd of 1929, they're going to sign a pact with each other, basically saying we're not going to go to war with each other. Now, they put a timestamp on it. It was a 10-year agreement. It's not going to last that long. But it was supposed to be a 10-year agreement, and the idea was they were going to carve up Poland between them. So the Soviet Union was going to get a little bit of Poland, and Germany was going to get a little bit of Poland. Well, when they signed this pact, Britain enters into a pact with the country of Poland, kind of a defensive alliance, like if you remember we saw before World War I. Basically drawing a line in the sand, and Britain saying, okay, if we consider any attack on Poland an attack on the British Empire. If you do this, we're going to go to war. Now, this is after we talked about with appeasement. This is after years of trying to avoid war. Britain's kind of drawing this line in the sand, saying you can't go any farther than this. Well, September 1st, 1939, Germany is going to invade Poland. They use what they call a blitzkrieg tactic. They're going to roll in, and they completely overwhelm the people of Poland. The military in Poland wasn't very advanced. Some of them were riding back or out on the horseback on the battlefields where they're fighting against tanks. And horse versus tank, not much of a battle. And so Germany's going to invade, and then about 2 weeks later, the Soviets are going to invade coming from the east, and they'll eventually take over that country and carve that country up. An awful lot of the citizens of Poland were Jewish, and so when we talk about the Holocaust, one of the things that we'll see is just how a lot of those folks sent to places like Auschwitz were Polish Jews that are going to be sent. The Soviets will also take the opportunity while this is going on to invade up to the north, to the country of Finland, which was another one of those World War I countries that had been carved out after the war, and so the Soviets will go and take over. As you can tell from our political cartoon here, though, it says someone's taking someone for a walk. It's only a matter of time, people feel like, before one of these guys is going to turn on the other one. We don't know if it's going to be Joseph Stalin. We don't know if it's going to be Adolf Hitler, but we know that this is not going to end well. Neither of these guys are trustworthy, and so the world's just kind of waiting to see what's going to end up happening. But the British declare war. One of my favorite guys really in world history, but definitely of this era, is the fellow that you see here, and his name is Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill is not the Prime Minister of Great Britain when the war gets started. It's a guy named Neville Chamberlain. This is the guy that tried to appease Hitler and keep peace. Well, obviously, when the war starts, he's out. Winston Churchill is in. The problem is, in the early days, they called it what they called the phony war. Because even though Britain had said, we'll go to war for Poland, they still had to gear up for warfare. You've got to get volunteers. You've got to draft men into military service. You've got to outfit those guys with the uniforms, the packs, the guns, everything that they're going to need. And then you have to transport them over to mainland Europe. And so it takes a while to mobilize all of those forces. And so in the early days, right, September on, really for a couple of months, there's not going to be any fighting, right? Technically, they're at war, but neither side is meeting the other on the battlefield yet. One of the things the British population did get were gas masks. You can see that propaganda poster that I've got there for you. Obviously, gas was a huge part of World War I. It's not going to be a part of World War II, but it was always kind of in the back of people's minds that this could be something. And so most citizens were given gas masks. I've even seen videos of, they had these infant gas masks. Basically, it was a bag. You'd zip your infant up, and then you could pump air because maybe you got a little one who can't keep a gas mask on, but you want to keep them safe. But war starts to creep in to the psyche of the British. Even though nobody's fighting on a battlefield yet, they're starting to take steps to be involved. Things really get serious when France ends up falling to the Germans. The Germans will attack. They move into the region there between Germany, France, and Belgium that had been kind of a sore spot at the end of World War I, and then eventually they will march to Paris. You see there in the bottom picture, a picture of Hitler in front of the Eiffel Tower. There's something, if you ever get a chance to go to Paris, there's a large structure called the Arc de Triomphe, and it was built by Napoleon. He was supposed to march through it victorious, and he doesn't. He never gets the chance. Hitler marches the Nazis through that as he's taking over France. Now, this is a big deal because France was, at this point in the war, the main ally of Great Britain. So really the fall of France is going to leave them kind of isolated against the Axis powers of World War II. Hitler is going to make the French surrender in the same train car where the French made the Germans surrender in World War I. We said he's trying to roll back a lot of these things the Versailles Treaty has done. He's a student of history, and so he looks and says, this is the message that we want to be sending, right? This is a rollback of the tragedy, the injustice that happened at the end of World War I. They're not going to make France part of Germany. They're going to install a Nazi-friendly government into France, and those are referred to as the Vichy French. So if you watch a classic movie like Casablanca in the film library, you'll hear them refer to Vichy France. Basically, when you hear that, that's a French government that's been installed that was friendly to Adolf Hitler. Marshal Pétain is going to be the guy who is leading that. The French resistance, and there's a strong French resistance throughout the war, is going to be led by a man named Charles de Gaulle. To tell you how World War II ends, when you fly to Paris today, you fly into Charles de Gaulle Airport. He is the first post-war president of a free France once the Nazis are kicked out. Told you this movie is in the film library. A lot of people consider it to be the best movie ever made. It's a romantic movie, Casablanca. If you get a chance, actually, I'll tell you what, I'll get on Swank too and see if I can't just put the link up for this one. It's a fantastic movie. A lot of great movie lines that come from this one. Humphrey Bogart is there. One of my favorite old-time actors. He's there with Ingrid Bergman in the story of kind of these two reunited lovers in Casablanca, which is in Africa during the Nazi occupation. It's just great old Hollywood. So if you get a chance, be sure to check that out. A couple of other things. One that recently has gotten in the news because of gotten into pop culture because of a couple of movies that have come out, both of which are in the film library. We've got one called Darkest Hour that looks at this event from the perspective of Winston Churchill. There's also one called Dunkirk, which if you're a One Direction fan has got Mr. Harry Styles in it in his film debut, but it's all about the Battle of Dunkirk. Dunkirk, if you look at the map there, is on the coast of France. And as you can see from that map, the Nazis are advancing, and they've got French forces and British forces trapped between them and the ocean. The French had this thing called the Maginot Line, which was a series of defensive placements they put between them and Germany that was supposed to keep Germany from invading France. Obviously, it doesn't work. And once Germany invades, even as the British show up on the continent, they can't stop the Nazi momentum. And they're pushed all the way back to the sea. And so in a desperate time, Winston Churchill calls on civilian boats, we're talking small little fishing boats, to come across the 30 some odd miles of the English Channel and to pick up British and French soldiers from Dunkirk. It's one of the ways that Hitler kind of screws up in World War II. Had he pressed his advantage at Dunkirk and not given him a chance to evacuate, he probably kind of zaps British strength. But he's trying to negotiate from kind of a benevolent position. And so he makes the decision, hey, we're not gonna crush these guys. We're gonna give them a chance to give up. Well, they sneak these boats in, end up sneaking 330,000 soldiers out of France and back over to Great Britain. It's referred to in history as the miracle at Dunkirk. Like I said, both of those films that I mentioned are fantabulous films. So if you like kind of the Hollywood stuff, especially if you like war movies, if you like Winston Churchill, right? That's those are definitely one to see. I really recommend. I like The Darkest Hour, probably the best of the two of them, but they're both really good war films. Winston Churchill, after the Dunkirk is over, makes a declaration. He says, the Battle of France is over, right? France has been taken over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. He knew that with France gone, the only target Germany had left, the only thing standing in their way of European domination is the British Empire. And so they're going to have to find a way to attack Britain. But to attack Britain, what you've got to do is you've got to overcome that English Channel that's in between the two. And so forces are going to have to find a way over. Now, the Germans are going to do that with bombers and nighttime bombings and things like that. One of the cultural references we get from that, if you look at these pictures here, are some movies that end up coming out. Peter Pan 2 there at the top, Bedknobs and Broomsticks, and probably if you've seen one, you've seen the one on the left, which is the Chronicles of Narnia. What they end up doing in these cities that were going to be targeted by the Germans, they end up taking the children and moving them outside of the cities. And so people that lived in the rural areas actually took in the children of people in these in the cities in order to protect them from these nighttime bombings. People still had to stay in places like London because you needed business to go on for the war effort and other things, but you wanted to get as many people out of harm's way as you could. So there's some really neat stories that end up coming out of that. What's going to happen is there's this enormous battle. It's going to be 6 months worth of airplane battles across the English Channel and across the British countryside. The Germans are going to have better, more maneuverable planes. They're going to have more planes. But the British are going to have kind of that indelible British spirit about them. Winston Churchill is going to prove himself to be a fantastic wartime leader. And as he's much more of kind of a pep talk kind of guy. So I've got a little bit about the Battle of Britain here. The Royal Air Force, the British Air Force, is actually going to fight back the Germans and keep the inevitable invasion from happening. So the British Empire survives. And he says, the gratitude of every home in our island, in our empire, and indeed throughout the world, except in the abodes of the guilty, goes out to the British airmen who, undaunted by the odds, unwearied in their constant challenge and mortal danger, are turning the tide of the world war by their prowess and by their devotion. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. And that's a famous quote that'll follow Churchill after World War II has finished. What we end up seeing is once France falls, Hitler kind of feels like he's strong enough to take on the Soviet Union. And so he signs an alliance in September, so almost or a little more than a year after the war starts, with Italy and Japan, and they become what is known as the Axis powers. We're going to see the first fighting happen in northern Africa, and then a year after France has fallen, Germany is going to attack the Soviet Union. So he's going to stab Stalin in the back, as you can see from our political cartoon there, and then World War II will begin in earnest. We'll talk about what happens between those two sides, but now the Soviet Union is going to find themselves allied with Britain, and then 6 months later with the United States, as the United States joins in. One other small note here, September 3rd, 1949 is the first time we see the gas chambers being used at Auschwitz. And so kind of calling out what we're going to see a little later as we talk about the Holocaust. But these are the early days leading up to and kind of before American involvement in World War II. Like I said, a lot of great movies, got a lot of great books that are set in this era. So if you're interested in those, let me know, and I can get you some more information.